We're having a really important conversation today. It's on a topic that often lives in the shadows because, for one reason or another, people don't want to talk about it, even though it's really something that needs to be talked about. It's when someone wants to be a parent and that dream does not come to fruition. This topic is probably triggering for some, and that's incredibly understandable. I would still recommend listening because our guest talks about how she's been processing her grief and the path she's taking toward finding acceptance. We also have an intuitive therapist who joins the conversation, and she provides some guidance on how to navigate this experience, to take steps toward healing and eventually acceptance. Please enjoy Child-Free, Not by Choice, and the Path to Acceptance. Hi, welcome to Doing This Differently, a podcast that celebrates non-traditional family structures. I'm your host, Nicole Foley, a solo mom living in San Francisco with my daughter, Dylan. In each episode, we talk to families who are forging their own unique paths, and together we expand our definition of what family looks like. A common theme shared across many of our previous episodes is one where a guest finds themselves on a life path that looks different from the one they may have envisioned for themselves earlier on. Today, we're talking to someone who really wanted to become a mother, and she pursued several avenues to make that happen. Ultimately, it didn't happen, and she's not alone. This is a more common story than many of us realize, but it's not one often told. I'm really grateful to her for having the courage to share her story with us. And this is a particularly special episode for me because our guest happens to be a very close friend of mine, and I witnessed parts of her journey, including some of her grieving process. Also with us is an intuitive therapist who will provide some guidance on how to navigate the grief of a dream like motherhood not coming to fruition, and how to move through that process into a state of acceptance. And with that, I'd like to introduce our guests. Andrea Lira is an ICF certified coach and organization development professional. She supports individuals, teams, and organizations through periods of change, helping them leverage transition as a means for generating greater potential and fulfillment, both professionally and personally. Meg Michaelson is a therapist specializing in relationships with self and others. She works with individuals in private consultations as well as leading group workshops across the country. Using her knowledge of the human energy body, intuition, and personal soul contracts, she guides others toward a healthier version of self. Andrea and Meg, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me as part of this.
Of course. And a special shout out to Andrea for having the strength to be vulnerable by sharing your story with us. So Andrea, can you describe the environment you grew up in and what you envision your future to look like as it relates to family?
Sure. And first, I just want to say, Nicole, thank you for providing this space and this platform to discuss this experience. It's my hope that it will serve others, and it is a very vulnerable experience in my life, but I feel like talking about it is very helpful to the processing that I continue to move through. Yeah, I was born and raised in Maryland, in a suburb outside of Washington, D.C. I was one of two children, the oldest. I had a younger brother, 3 years younger than me, and was raised in a two-parent household. We were pretty typical middle-class family. My mom was a nurse. My dad worked in construction. And for the most part, yeah, we had everything that we needed. I look back on my childhood with generally fond memories. My parents' two values very important in the household were hyper responsibility and independence. So I think that influenced greatly how I move through the world today. That superseded the experience of emotional nurturance in the household. And the only reason I mention that is just to give background in terms of how my upbringing influenced or not my decision to pursue motherhood. It always has been something since I was young that partly I assumed I would always become a mother just because it just seems like that's what one does. But I also genuinely really wanted it. I've always really enjoyed children, started babysitting at a very young age, loved all my baby cousins to death. And yeah, it was just something I always knew at some point in life would happen. All that being said, I was very kind of free spirit, so appreciated the freedom in my earlier adult life in terms of the whole scenario of marriage, children, just something I assumed. My parents weren't necessarily the best relationship model. And the idea of getting older and raising a family and having kids wasn't really talked about a lot in my household. But nonetheless, it was just something that I think, like most people growing up in society, it's something you think will happen.
Definitely. And I'll just add to that, Dre is one of the most nurturing people I know, and she is phenomenal with children. I have to say that.
Thanks, Nicole.
Tell us about the journey you took toward motherhood. And we can break this up a little bit. We can start with just giving us a high-level version of what did dating look like through your 20s, 30s, into your 40s?
In my 20s, I wasn't too concerned about the when and the how. I just assume eventually it happens. I do remember thinking somewhat intentionally that this isn't something I want to force or I want to dictate my life around. And in my mid-20s, I was in a relationship, actually the longest relationship of my adult life, with a man that I lived with. And in the earlier half of the relationship, we both thought that we were going to get married one day and have kids. We would even talk about what we were going to name our kids. And then as we got further along into the relationship, as one would say, after the honeymoon period, it was interesting because we would actually talk about just random different aspects of raising children. And it was through some of those spontaneous conversations that it became very clear to me that we had very different values, parenting values that were influenced by the way that we were raised. I think I mentioned that, my parents were really, especially my mom, instilled that value of hard work, responsibility. And so I was naturally thinking of bringing that in my own version into my own way of parenting, whereas my boyfriend at the time was raised with a silver spoon and didn't necessarily share that same value with me. So that wasn't the reason why we decided to end the relationship, but it was one of several. And it was interesting because at a certain point, I just couldn't see him being the person that I would raise children with, which influenced my decision to let the relationship go.
Yeah, I can imagine those are two very different upbringings that are going to shape different worldviews. So I'm just curious, do you have an example of one of those moments where you're like, whoa, this is different from how I see my parenting in the future?
It's funny when I think back to it, it was just the most spontaneous of moments. We were in the car driving. I think we were going through a drive-through somewhere, and we were just talking about, I don't even know how we got on the topic, but talking about if we had kids, when our son or daughter is turning 16 and can drive. I think I was using it as an example. I said, for example, I would not, even if we could buy them a luxury car to gift them, I wouldn't. I would talk to them about how we can work together to get a solid used car, and so that they can understand, like, they need to contribute, whether it's to the car insurance or to the actual purchase of the car. And he said, I don't get that. He goes, if we can, why wouldn't we just buy them a car? I mean, I want my child to have a nice car. If I can buy him a Beamer, then I will. And I felt my mom being channeled through me in that moment. And I said, absolutely not. No,
Yeah.
like, I do not want to raise someone who thinks that things are just going to be handed to them on a silver platter. So, and we actually got into a little argument about it. And I remember in that moment, like, I don't know if this is going to work. Not us, but the idea of parenting, like, how would we parent together? We would be on such different pages. And that's just one example of which you could extrapolate any number of different ways that would be expressed across the course of a child's life and young adult's life. So
Totally. And I think it comes across as just this like small detail. It's not a small detail. And one thing that I've noticed with couples who co-parent, whether they're married or partnered, their worldviews don't necessarily clash pre-children. It's more of like, oh yeah, he feels this way, she feels that way. And they're not, it's when it's applied to something as concrete as parenting, that even like thoughts about religion, where it's like, yeah, we're different religions, but that's cool. And then you have the child and you're like, okay, I didn't realize I was going to feel this way, but I want, and those are major. And I feel like finances is always a big one. And that was astute of you to have that moment of like, wait a second, are we on the same page? Because that's a big one. That's a big one when it comes to money.
Yeah. And there were others too. We were raised in different cultures, and which I absolutely respected. But to your point, sometimes you don't know when those friction points are going to present when you're forming a household, a family, and imparting values. It's ideal for parents to be on the same page, or at least be able to figure out a way to compromise to get there. So I'm glad for that conversation we had. I would say after that relationship is when I really dove into dating. I think at the time it was Match.com had come out and hit the scene. And it was my first experience with online dating. And it was, as a young woman, you're just looking, there's so many options. And it was really kind of fun and, just to experiment with meeting different people. And at that point in my life, in my career, I was working with a lot of people in my same age group, and we were just having a lot of fun. I was living in Washington, D.C., and meeting guys, no one really special, but having fun. And this was my late 20s, and moving into my 31st year, I was in another relationship with a wonderful man, and he really raised the bar for me from an emotional intelligence point of view. He had children. He was open to having more. So that was a green light for me, but for other reasons, circumstantial, it didn't work out. That was really hard for me. It took me a solid year to get over that. And that kind of led me into my early 30s, which is when, the idea of dating, okay, when I'm ready, like I'm ready to meet someone that I could have children with, that I could have a family with. And that started becoming a consideration more at the forefront of my dating experience, but still not a ton of pressure. And I was still hearing from many people, whether family or other friends, you're still young, you have time. And that was so comforting to me at the moment. And I was like, yeah, I have time. Okay. I don't need to force this. I don't need to, be quote unquote one of those women that's going to corner a guy. And that's a stereotype. But, I applaud women who are very intentional and discerning about finding a partner to raise a family with. So I had a couple relationships. They weren't quote unquote the one. I've never been one to stay in a relationship that didn't feel right. And at the end of a relationship that was a year long with a man who was a little ambivalent about whether or not he wanted children, which was an issue, but he would vacillate back and forth. When that relationship finally ended, I was 36. And it was at that point that the pressure was visceral. And it really put a lot of pressure on the dating experience for me. And yeah, I had a lot of bumpy, somewhat awkward attempts at conversations with men that I would meet, and trying to figure out, do they want kids? Do they want a family? But not wanting to raise it too soon, and not wanting to be too transparent about it, too eager, because it is a very real thing that a lot of guys will get scared away. And I wish more men were upfront about, their own decision around family or not. So yeah, that's when the questions of alternatives of how I'm going to become a mother started entering my mental sphere, and led to a few different attempts to pursue it outside the traditional meet the right guy, decide to partner up, and have a family.
Yeah, that's what I call plan A. Let's talk about those other avenues that you explored?
Yeah. So after that relationship that ended, and I was just beginning my 36 year, a very dear friend of mine, one of my best friends, a gay man, we were having dinner, and it was on my mind, this idea of co-parenting. And, you know, it was coincidentally, it was on his mind too. I guess he had been thinking about parenthood. I had been thinking about it. And so we had this conversation around, what do you think of the idea of co-parenting? And we were both, our interest was both piqued. So we started exploring the topic more seriously, doing it with each other. I think the exploration probably took place over the course of a year, lightly doing Google searches around like, how do you set up the legal structure to support that. We were intentionally spending more time together. We took some big trips internationally, which were really fun, but gave us an opportunity to really get to know each other when you're with someone 24/7 for 3 weeks.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And all the signals kept pointing to this could work. And we got back from a trip that we had taken to Turkey, and we're feeling really good about this possibility. And literally a week after we got back from the trip, he called me up and he told me that he had just been diagnosed with testicular cancer. And he had to move fast in terms of making decisions around treatment. And we had a conversation. He was just overwhelmed with all of it, understandably
Of course, yeah.
so.
Oh, yeah.
And we had a conversation around how the doctors were telling him, look, if you want to have a family, you should really, freeze your sperm. And he made a comment, and I think and he recounts it as, I was just so overwhelmed, but he made a comment like, well, the only reason I would do that would be for you. And, I looked at him and I said, I really think that that's a decision that in the midst of everything that you're going through right now, if you're going to take that step, you should do it for you. And ultimately it was just his bandwidth wasn't, he just didn't want to introduce a whole nother set of steps, and he didn't do it. And then he went through his chemo treatment, and then we just kind of let that go, maybe to explore at another point, but it became more around supporting him through that. So the co-parenting option was no longer on the table. And I would say around that time, I was also starting to think about freezing my eggs, because I was starting to hear more and more about that. And what's interesting is today for young women, I feel like the idea of freezing eggs is so much more ubiquitous and discussed than it was even just 10 years ago.
And more accessible.
And I remember, and more accessible depending on if you work for a company that has fertility benefits.
Yeah.
And to your point on accessibility, when I had first had someone mention to me, well, why don't you just freeze your eggs? I was 35. I was in that relationship, and it was one of his friends. It was a woman. And I remember thinking, yeah, I don't have that kind of money just laying around to go out and do it. And in my head at the time, I said, and if I get to the point where, my fertility isn't what it needs to be to get pregnant, then maybe that just wasn't meant to be. It was a very fatalistic view, but it was also because I really felt like dishing out 10 plus grand to freeze my eggs just was not a possibility for me at that time. Fast forward 3-4 years, I was looking at my, modest savings, and I feel like the aspiration to become a mother was still there and becoming stronger and stronger. And I decided it was something I wanted to prioritize. So I looked into it and pursued it. And it wasn't until I started having those first conversations with the doctors at the fertility clinic that I realized, wow, they talk very specifically about, the trajectory of a woman's fertility and when it starts to drop, early mid 30s, and, looking at where I was now. And there was very much this kind of tone of like, you need to do this now. Like, if you're going to do this, every day counts. And I remember thinking, why didn't they teach us this way back when, in sex ed, when really the angle I felt, and it's an angle I carried with me all through my 20s and early 30s when I wasn't ready to become pregnant, was like, all the ways that you can avoid getting pregnant.
It's the other way. Yeah, exactly.
Versus the challenges of becoming pregnant, right? You have this very small window every month that you could get pregnant. And so anyway, I just remember feeling so, what's the word? Like, not cheated, but like, God, I wish I knew this, when I was younger. But at any rate, I froze my eggs at 39 and would have done another round if I had more resources, but I didn't. I got what I got. I wasn't thrilled with it, but it was something in terms of the number of viable eggs that came from that. And then I felt like, okay, this gives me a little bit of time, maybe takes the pressure off of dating just a notch, a little bit. So, yeah.
I think that's a really common experience for women. I know, I think it was also 36 for me, where there were people around me. They're just like, you have to do it now. You have to do it now. Like, don't wait until you're 37. And at the time, I just didn't have the means. And to me, it's kind of more than a miracle that I was able to do what I did out of pocket. But like at that time, it wasn't an option. And I'm watching these people around me do it. And I think what was really tough for me to witness was just that look of relief, that because exactly what you said, it just took the pressure off of dating. And I know that some women maintained the age of their eggs on dating apps. Like, they could be 4 years older, but they're like, but my eggs are 36. And I, that I mean, I imagine that anyone listening to this could relate to either your position, my position, your position at 36, and then also just finally being able to do it, which is a phenomenal resource that we have available to us. At what point were you considering other avenues after freezing your eggs?
I had a dear friend who was considering solo motherhood and actually went through with it at the time. I think I was 39, 40, right around that time I froze my eggs. And so having a front row seat to her experience really brought it to life for me. And I saw, what was involved. And I also was thinking through all the considerations that one thinks through when going through that, as you know. And I kind of let it just continue to percolate in the back of my mind. Meanwhile, I was continuing to date. And honestly, I would say that, my late 30s, early 40s, dating can become rife with trials and tribulations. It's definitely different than dating, or it felt different than dating in my early 30s. And when I was 41, I met a wonderful man, and he was such a breath of fresh air from some of the other experiences that I had across those 2 years. And I remember it was on our third date that organically the topic of family came up, and I learned, record scratch, that he didn't want kids. And I can remember where we were, and I remember thinking, oh gosh, always a catch, right? But I was really enjoying getting to know him, and I thought, you know what, he's worth continuing to get to know him, given the quality that he is comparably to other men I had been meeting. And I decided to just put it aside, the kid question, for a bit, to see, what emerges for me. We decided to enter an exclusive relationship, but all the while, like that question of, is this right for me? Am I selling out on myself? What do I want? And that notion of, you have a lifetime to meet a partner, but only a window to have a child, was very much in the forefront of my mind. And so I was really, really conflicted. And there came a point in his own journey where he had been long considering getting a vasectomy before I entered the picture. And he did. And I was a supportive girlfriend, if this is what he wants to do. But that really brought it to like the distillation of witnessing that and witnessing what comes up for me, really brought me into a place of, what am I doing? Like, what do I want? And I ended up ending the relationship because I just couldn't deny myself. I don't think I would have been able to live in peace with myself if I didn't at least try.
Side note, for anyone going through this experience of trying to become a parent, especially when you are exploring avenues that are far less than conventional, you end up having conversations with yourself in terms of like, what lengths am I going to go to here? What's my limit? For some people, they will go so many rounds of IVF, putting their body through a lot of stress, not just their body, putting their mind, their soul, everything, sometimes relationships, through a lot of stress to get to that goal of having a child. The way that Dre describes this, I really relate to. I had to have that conversation with myself. What am I willing to do? I had to identify, where would the regret live? Would the regret live in not having a child, or would it be not trying? And where I landed was, I would feel regret if I didn't try. So that's why I took the path that I did. And if you listen to previous episodes, especially the first one where I talk about my own personal journey to bring Dylan into this world, I definitely weighed this heavily. I really gave it so much thought, did so much soul searching. But one thing that was very clear to me is that I don't know if I would have regretted not having children, but I would certainly have regretted not trying. I'm curious if other people can relate to that. For me, I felt like, I'm going to give it everything I got, and that's what I did. I was fortunate. I was fortunate to have Dylan, but I do know that it was the trying that was so necessary for me. I have to give this a try. I wonder how many other people can relate to that experience. And as Dre's friend, I can tell you she really, really tried. And back to the conversation.
And I would say within a month after ending that relationship, I was at the fertility clinic. I was lining up the process to pursue an IVF transfer. I was starting to think about the process of looking for a sperm donor. And I was mentally, emotionally, and spiritually preparing myself, my body, my heart, my soul for this journey. And I had just enough resources to do one transfer. And this was at a point that I was still funding it myself. But I felt it was this moment where I either do it, or it could be something I live with and regret forever. And so, spending down my savings in a meaningful way was worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was on my path. And I think it was 4 months later, after we broke up, we were still friends. And he came back and, he basically said, look, I've thought about it. And I guess he was at a point in his life where he was thinking about what he wants his life to look like moving forward, community, family, and he changed his mind. And at the time, I was so along in my process and I was so caught off guard. And I guess at that moment, it wasn't a slam dunk for me for whatever reason, but it was an invitation into exploring, wow, maybe I could get the plan A. But I wasn't 1,000% like, still, we were not in a relationship long enough for me to be ready to say, I'm ready to commit
Mm-hmm.
lifelong with this person. And, I remember thinking, I wish I could just, you know, be okay with not knowing if he and I have the right connection and the right stuff to make that level of commitment and say, I'm just going to go for it. We'll figure the rest out later. But I am a person, for better or for worse, that I I dot all my I's, I cross all my T's. It's probably related to the value of being hyper responsible that I was raised with. And I said, look, like, we still need to explore us. But in the meantime, because the clock is ticking for me, if I am going to pause my journey that I've started, then we should be creating embryos now.
Mm. Yeah.
Because every day, I felt like every day my egg quality is declining. So I just share that. And I don't know how to someone outside the experience, that just might sound so crazy, but it just is, I think, emblematic of how much pressure
Mm-hmm.
as a woman I was feeling to, like, I was just like, oh my God, the runway is quickly, like, I'm approaching the end. And so we did that together. We had the resources to do that. And we did. And all the while continued to explore each other. And I think the pressure of all of it inhibited an organic unfolding of what we were as a couple. And ultimately, we decided to break up. And this is worth mentioning because it's significant to what came next for me. As we were exploring relationship together, I was serendipitously recruited by a big tech company, and wasn't necessarily a slam dunk in terms of like, yes, this is the job that I want. But I was looking to leave the job that I was currently in. I had been in it for 7 years, and it was an opportunity worth exploring. I actually never thought that I would get it. And when they came with an offer, I was shocked. And when I reviewed the compensation package and reviewed what the fertility insurance
Oh,
includes
yeah.
and
Yep.
the degree of coverage that it provides, I felt like it was synchronicity at play. This is my ticket to pursuing and exhausting all means to see if I can become a solo mother. I took the job, high pressure job. And when my boyfriend at the time and I decided to end the relationship, it was literally maybe a month and a half before COVID hit.
Oh, right. God.
And COVID hit, and all of a sudden, my desire to, like, okay, we're gonna make the most out of these fertility benefits. I put a pause on my internal process, because the vulnerability that COVID exposed for so many people, especially families, single parents, solo parents with young children at home, where no longer childcare is available, and everyone's like figuring out, how do I do this with my little ones at home and I still have to work? I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I just don't
Mm.
know, and I was witnessing firsthand my friend who went the solo motherhood route and was successful. And at the time, she had a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old. So I had a front row seat to what that was like.
Yeah. No, that I can't even imagine, honestly. Ugh.
So So there was a period where I'm like, maybe I'm not going to do this. But then a few months pass, and that soul calling, which is what it felt like, was there, and it was knocking on my door pervasively. And I mean, I'll be, candid. I wasn't loving the role that I was in. It was, a great company to work for, but it just wasn't. So I thought, like, what am I doing? Like, what? I took this job ultimately to be able to pursue this opportunity. I mean, pardon like my language, but it was really like a shit or get off the pot. Like, it's time to make a decision. And I was grateful for that, because it was time. And I finally decided, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it because I just want to figure out once and for all. I was at this intersection of life. What is the next half of my life going to look like? Am I going to be a mother or am I not? And depending on what the outcome is, my life is going to look very different. So I need to figure this out. And so that's when I went back to the fertility clinic I had been working with, got all the things in motion, got the calendar down, started the process. And I was able to do 2 rounds of IVF based on the number of viable embryos that came out of that very long, it's like funnel process. You start out with so many eggs that are frozen, they unfreeze them, how many are viable, how many survive the defrost, selected the sperm donor, which is its own process, fertilize them, how many became viable, and then start the process. And, I mean, all hormones, injections, like, yeah. And the first round, I think they transferred 3 embryos. I mean, I was feeling good. I was doing a lot of visualization around this is going to happen. I was trying to allow myself to believe that it could happen. My parents were actually supportive, which was a big shift, because my mom, when I was 39 freezing my eggs, was not, she just thought it was all kind of weird and was not the most supportive. But she came around, I guess, because she saw how important it was to me. That was huge, especially since this was COVID and my parents were some of the only people that I was seeing on a regular basis. So when the first round didn't work, it felt like a punch in the stomach. And it was like a rude, sobering awakening. When you go through life and people are like, oh, it's going to happen one day, you're still young. And this idea that it's going to happen. I had seen it happen for people in my friend community. I mean, at the time, my friend that already had a 4-year-old, and then I had 2 other friends, you and my other friend, that were also pursuing solo motherhood. We were all in different points of our IVF journey. And when it didn't work, I was the first, at least at that time, the first friend that it didn't work for. And I'm like, oh no, because the first round, they always use your best embryos. And I was trying to keep the faith, and I knew I had another round that I could do. And thanks to the insurance, I'm like, great, let's do it. And I lined it up well. I lined up, giving myself some space after that second round for me to absorb whatever the outcome was going to be, so that I could, take some time off of work, because one of the hard parts was holding the emotional disappointment and then just jumping back into life as usual.
Right.
And
just
then
like shoving it away.
Yeah, you just have to put it aside, right? I didn't realize at the time that it was such an acute grief experience, like, because I think maybe at the time I still thought of grief as when you lose someone. So I just trucked on and did the second round, and I remember where I was. I remember where I was both times that I got the call from the clinic when they were calling to tell you the results. And I mean, I can even like feel into what that feeling is now. It was just, yeah, I mean, it's just like someone takes this dream away from you. And after the second transfer, when I knew, I'm like, that's it, game over. Like, that's when, I mean, yeah, I went through a period of like pretty intense grief and darkness around like, oh my gosh, what's going to become, like, what does this mean for my life right now? Like, so yeah, that was in late 2020. So yeah, it's been a few years.
Side note, for anyone embarking on the journey to parenthood, in this case, motherhood, there are a lot of steps involved, especially if this is beyond just the old-fashioned way. And sometimes the old-fashioned way takes a long time as well. But in Dre's case, she describes all the things that she did, the hormones, freezing eggs, embryo making. There's so much involved, and it's actually extremely common. Very few people I know these days who have had children the old-fashioned way. Generally, a lot of people need some assistance, particularly after a particular age. And at some point, you have to decide, or maybe a decision is made for you, that your journey is complete. I talked about the grieving process in the previous episode. That really applies here. There is a lot of grief, and it's heartbreaking for me as Dre's friend to hear her describe that as someone taking her dream away. I know she's not alone in that experience. And I have to say, I went through my own grieving for her, because I'm sure we can all relate to seeing somebody who absolutely deserves to be a mother is so naturally nurturing and incredible with kids. It just doesn't feel fair. And I know that fair is not necessarily part of the equation, but in watching a friend go through this, it's incredibly devastating and oftentimes really hard to know how to support. And we're going to talk about that a little later in the episode. But I wanted to take a pause here and just acknowledge the grief that comes along with really wanting to be a mom and that dream not coming to fruition. And back to the conversation. Where are you in your grieving process now?
I'm in a very different place than I was back in late 2020. I recently heard someone shared with me an Instagram reel with Jay Shetty, and he was talking about, he gave this beautiful metaphor that I guess he had heard from someone around grief. And the metaphor basically is that grief is like a stone that one carries around in their pocket essentially forever. And in the beginning, in the acute stages of grief, that stone feels really, really heavy in your pocket, and you feel weighted down by it, sometimes to the point where you can't even stand up. But with time, the stone doesn't change size, it weighs the same, but the holder of the stone grows stronger, heals, processes. We move forward in life one step at a time, and over time that stone feels lighter. And so I feel like at this point in my journey, the stone feels lighter. The stone is absolutely still there. And you know, they say, and it's so true, grief is not a linear process. I don't think there's any end to grief. And I lost my mom last year rather unexpectedly. And so I've had that journey of grief as well. And it's been I mean, there have been a lot of parallels, I think, just in the experience of grief. And so I would say where I am today is I have fully stepped into the second half of my life, knowing that I'm not going to become a mother. I've done a lot of processing around that. I will say that there are moments when I could be with families or somewhere where I'm observing families or a mother with their child and just observing the bond. And it stings a little because there's a part of me that really, really wanted that. And I mean, even now, it like brings up emotion, which I didn't necessarily expect, but I'm able to be with that. I'm used to that stone being there. And so I can, take care of myself and, just I'm in more of a place of acceptance with it.
And I just want to say, as your friend, and as you and I spent a lot of time together during the pandemic, especially while I was pregnant. And I think one of the hardest things for me was, how do I support you? How do I support you during this? Because I said it earlier, but I feel like it deserves another mention. When I think of all the people in my life in terms of like, who's super nurturing, who does, when I watch Friends with Dylan, like, oh gosh, that love and nurturing, it's just so natural for you. As your friend, I just felt like this is so wrong. This is so unfair. Like all the obvious thoughts, right? But it's one of these things that it's such a tender topic. It's such a difficult topic. It's extremely hard to witness, especially when you wanted an outcome that differs from the one that you got, like for your friend. I want to ask you, like, what was helpful during that time? Because I think anyone listening to this who may not have been on the journey that you've been on, but maybe had been in my shoes as a witness, especially while being pregnant, which how could that not be triggering on some level? And as you pointed out, you had other friends who were going through that process as well. And I'm curious to hear, because I know a lot of people are super well intentioned and may not be mindful of blind spots. I'm guilty of it for sure. Just in all facets of life. Sometimes I'm like, oh my God, why did I say that? Or why did I do that? And I'm sure a lot of people have that self-reflection as well. Some don't. But I want to know if you have examples of when the support was hitting the right note and when maybe attempts were not. And using this as an opportunity for others to learn from this, and myself included, how to support a friend who is going through this process.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I had 4 friends that were pregnant around me, which, man, which obviously makes it challenging for, a number of different reasons, because it's such a beautiful, magical time in a woman's life. And I really, as a friend to you, to 3 of my other friends, I wanted to celebrate and mark the moment with and for you all. And I will say that I'm fortunate to have such amazing friends, such as yourself, who understood where I was. And when I, you know, very vulnerably just said, look, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to show up in the way that I would want to. And I'm probably going to have to take a little bit of space. You all, still loved me and totally understood. And that was huge. So I would just say, I mean, well, first, from a blind spot standpoint, my experience of trying to become pregnant and not becoming pregnant, which, when I think about family and friends and, I have my inner circle friends, I have the friends, second circle, I have, friends like you who, we were all very much in this journey towards motherhood. It looked slightly different for all of us. And I have other friends who weren't. And I would say that for some of the friends that weren't, and even family, like they didn't necessarily recognize that I was in an acute stage of grief.
Mm.
I think, like I said, and I'm probably even guilty of this, like grief is kind of reserved for people when they lose someone. And so there were certain moments where I whether, you know, it was based on a comment that a friend might have said to me or something that I had inferred, but there was this kind of sense of, because I went through a very tumultuous kind of dark time afterwards for a few months. And there was like this notion of like, oh, you're still, wow, you're still really going through it. And so that for me is a blind spot. And I, you know, love my friends, and it's just a process. It's just an experience they didn't fully understand. And so I would just say, for a woman who is grieving the loss of opportunity to become a mother, that grief is the same as any grief. It's the same as losing, you know, someone who you had a primary relationship with. You're losing the relationship that you had to your future potential child. So that's one. I think, you know, I think about one friend in particular who, it was just a gesture that really, really felt so nurturing and loving. Was they just showed up and brought me soup. And I love soup. It's like my comfort food. And that's what one does, you know, when someone, like when I lost my mom, I had lots of friends showing up, whether it's with DoorDash certificates or food. And it's just such a loving gesture. And when that friend did that for me during that time, came over and dropped it off. Again, this is during the height of COVID too. So, you know, the ways that we could see and be and relate with each other were slightly different, but they dropped it off at the doorstep, and it was just so lovely. So I would just say it's, yeah, I mean, if someone is vulnerable enough to share their experience with you, like, and it doesn't work out for them, is just basically do what you would do for any grieving friend. Just hold space. There's really nothing anyone can say. And I know that's the hardest part. People want to say the right thing. And I experienced this also when my mom passed. And the best thing anyone can do is just be there and listen. And you don't even need to say anything. You just show up and check in. And that's like everything.
Side note, I'm really glad that Andrea brought up this point. When it comes to supporting a friend going through any grieving process, but particularly this situation where someone really wanted to become a mom, it's not happening, and they need support. How do we support that friend? I learned a while ago that coming up with solutions or try to problem solve or look at the bright side, I'm really fortunate that I learned that those are not helpful in most cases. Dre and I had a conversation after we recorded this where we were talking about this, and she was saying that when she was having that experience, people did not know how to just sit with her in the grief and just hold space. Instead, she had the experience where some people were extremely well intentioned. They really wanted to be helpful. And instead, they were like, but you have other embryos. And for anyone who is unfamiliar with the IVF process, fertility clinics, fertility doctors, whoever you're seeing, they choose the best embryos first. If the first ones didn't work, there's a high chance subsequent ones will not. Andrea, with that knowledge, is not receiving that silver lining the way that the person sharing it probably intended. I'm not one to give advice, but I do want to relay that conversation, since Dre went through this herself, that just sitting with her as she's experiencing and feeling the grief is the best thing that someone can offer. It's not problem solving. It's not trying to find a silver lining. It's not making suggestions like, well, you can always adopt. Those are very well-intentioned people giving very well-intentioned support, but it may not be what your friend needs. So heeding what Andrea just mentioned that just holding space for that friend is the best thing we can do, even if it makes us uncomfortable. I think our culture is just really uncomfortable with discomfort. Sometimes you just need to sit next to your friend and let them talk, let them cry, let them be silent, and just be there with them. Be there with them, be there for them. And I appreciate that reminder. And back to the conversation. And I think you're pointing to something that's really important too. If somebody has not experienced grief, I'm guessing that's the case for the person who's like, oh, you're still feeling sad about that. I mean, it's just, I don't know if it's that they've never experienced grief or they're not understanding or appreciating how much grief is part of this journey. There's no time limit. I mean, as you said, it's your relationship to that experience that evolves over time, but it's not like, we hit the 6-month mark, I guess I'm okay now. It's not that. And so I think that's a helpful learning to share with others. And yeah, it is, as a friend witnessing this, and like I said, in a situation where I'm pregnant, and we were attempting to do the same thing essentially on a very similar timeline. It's hard, as you said, like for me, I knew that there was nothing I could say that's like, oh, and now she feels better. Oh my gosh, I did my job as a friend. Like, I knew that, but I will say it really challenged me. Like, how can I create a space that feels okay for her? You're very deliberate and very clear about, what would work for you and what wouldn't. And I loved that you turned down some invitations. Like, I knew that things were going, like, in our friend group, especially if they were like baby related. And I really appreciated that you were just like, I know what I can handle, and this is beyond that. And I'm gonna, and from what I could tell, our group was good about just understanding that. But kudos to you as well for advocating what you needed. And because I'm sure there's a lot of people who would be like, I have to go, it's this happy moment for them, even though I'm not feeling. Like, I just loved that you were so true to yourself, and you're just like, no, this isn't right for me right now. And no one questioned it, and we all loved you. Like, there's nothing, we just wanted to support you.
Yeah, yeah, and you all did, and I'm forever grateful. I think through both of my experiences with grief, it's a solo journey in many ways. Yes, community is important, but I really had to just allow myself to feel and trust that the light will come through again. And, there were a few different things that kind of helped me in those really kind of darker days to move through it. And I think, for any other women that may experience this, or as a possibility, you just think about how to resource yourself, like based on who I am and what speaks to me, like how do I want to set myself up. And I think that the ways that I did were ultimately helpful. One of them was community, but even in my kind of solo experience, like resources like Meg, who I did have a couple conversations with, and I had a therapist, and I spoke to a theta healer. I very much tried to bring in different perspectives to help me get out of the stuck place that I was feeling in.
And also, you pursued a path of coaching yourself. And I think you've had such a rich experience with grief for the dream of motherhood, grief of your mom. You've held a lot over the last few years. And I'm just saying that, like, you are so well equipped. You were naturally anyway, but with all of these experiences that you've had, you're in such an incredible position to guide others through periods of massive transition. And I'm so glad you found that path and that you're pursuing it, because I can't think of a better person to be leading in that way, in the work that you're going to be doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I learned a lot just having, and it definitely informs some of my work and how I want to support others moving through change that's unanticipated, as I call it, like involuntary change and transition. I didn't ask for it. And there's a lot of change and transition that life throws at us that we don't ask for. How do we move through that process of acceptance and looking at the opportunities and gifts that emerge in that transition?
Totally. And this is actually a perfect segue. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're fortunate to have Meg Michaelson with us, who Andrea just mentioned was part of her resource in terms of getting support. So I'd love to bring you back, Meg. Hi.
Hi, thank you.
And I've had a lot of experience with Meg. She's an incredible, incredible coach. And I love that she also brings her intuition into any topic that I've explored with her. It really just super, super helpful. So, Meg, in coaching individuals on how to navigate the grief process of a dream unrealized, what have you seen to be the most healing steps a person can take to move through it?
Yeah. Well, and first of all, I want to say, Andrea, you're doing so beautifully, and you know that. And so that you've been so vulnerable, because as you're putting this out there, there are other women I work with that are going through the same process. And to first acknowledge that death is death. It's not just a physical death, the death of a dream. Now, if an athlete has an injury and has to stop their career, or a divorce, or the loss of a child in utero, or the loss of not being able to have a child, that's all real. And when I was a foster mom for years, and I wanted to adopt a child, and didn't happen, and I had physical pain in my arm for years, and that's a loss. So any of that, and when people come in from the outside and don't understand it, that's okay. It is painful, but part of that healing is to understand they don't understand. And so when we can get to that place, and that takes time. No, as you said, it is a journey. So allowing yourself to have that space and not feeling like I'm going to rush through this process, or I'm going to hold it in my throat and just suck it up. I'm going to pretend, because it comes out sideways everywhere. We really can't do that with our emotions. First, we have to let ourselves grieve. And that looks different for everybody. Some people do that alone. Some people feel too alone doing it. And it's also really important to understand that, like you said, it's a journey. So there's going to be days when you feel okay, and then in 5 minutes, it hits you again. So giving yourself time, giving yourself that spectrum of time, whatever that means, in the way you can, because we have to still live our lives in whatever way we need to. And learning, importantly, this is so key, how to nurture self. We are a very Western society. We are doers. We're not real good at nurturing in our society. We're learning it. Mental health is becoming more out there, so we can actually speak about it, like this podcast, and to really talk about, what does it mean to nurture myself? What do I need? There's that concept of body, mind, soul. So we have to nurture all three of those. We have to nurture the physical body, our soul body, and our mental, emotional body. And everybody can. We don't always know how, especially if we haven't. But that takes that, God, what do I really need right now? And just having a little spare moments of silence. Maybe I need a bath. Maybe I just need someone to bring me soup. And if they don't, maybe I can ask for it. That's that journey of understanding, nurturing. Maybe I just want to cry for a little while. And so to be okay with emotions, because our society is shifting. Now there are more people than ever choosing not to be parents. And that helps the shame and the guilt that those women that can't have children because there is shame and guilt, right? Because our society for so long thinks we're supposed to have kids because we're women. I used to think everybody should have kids. I don't anymore. I had to evolve because not everyone should have kids and some people can't have kids. And as we're expanding, it does help to have that concept of I'm carrying shame and guilt, but that's being projected on me from others.
Side note, shame and guilt. Can we as a culture just stop doing that? What good do we think we're doing to make women feel like they have to have children? It drives me nuts. It drives me nuts. In the previous episode where I was talking to 3 child-free women, I sort of jokingly said that Gen Z is going to right size all of this for us. And it's aligned with what Meg just said about how younger generations are just opting out of parenthood. It's been well documented that younger generations, Gen Z, and probably plenty of millennials, just look at motherhood or parenthood as hard, not that enjoyable, expensive, and leaving a huge carbon footprint. So they're opting out. Another thing I said in the previous episode is that if there's one thing that most all cultures have in common is that there's a strong opinion as to what women should be doing. But I hope people understand how damaging that is, especially if you have somebody like Andrea, who very, 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 very much wanted to have a child and it didn't happen. That's not how she wanted it to go. But why would we have these societal norms making women feel less than for not having children? It's just not fair. It's not okay. And especially, women who choose not to have children, there should be zero guilt or shame. And I do appreciate that things are shifting, and things are shifting because the younger generations are less tolerant of that attitude. I hope it continues in that direction. Shame and guilt should not be part of this conversation, and it absolutely is very embedded and projected upon women. I wish people who felt strongly about that all women need to have children, my hope is that they have a moment of self-reflection to understand that, first of all, you don't understand every woman's circumstances. You don't know what led them to a child-free path. It's also none of your business. And to have some compassion, especially if you have no idea what led to that path. Let's support people in whatever path they're on, full stop. And back to the conversation.
And so really recognizing the shame and guilt and then letting go of that story because it's just a story. You didn't do anything wrong to deserve that part of your journey. You tried to rectify it, and recognizing those emotions that I have shame and guilt, and then stepping out of the story. Is that real? And is that necessary? And this, with everything else, a big part of our healing journey includes breathing. So breathing into those places, breathing into the body's loss. When you were going through it, and to those women that are going through it now or maybe going through it, where do you feel that pain in your body? Because it does have a physical component. So pay attention to where you feel it. Certainly the second chakra, that's our lower back and lower belly, and that is where the baby is conceived and the baby grows when we have a baby. So when you don't have a baby, there's a loss there. And there is that physical emptiness that women feel in that second chakra. So we really want to nurture that area. What does that mean? Put our hands on it. Breathe into it. Give yourself affirming words. Use that emotion to create something, because the second chakra is also, that's a biggie in our body. And that's our creation center. It's also the balance point. Balance of giving and receiving, the balance of doing and being, the balance of nurturing and work. So we want to be in that space of what can I create from this loss? Which segues to my next piece. There is a loss, like you said. And when we have that surrender point, we are now resolved to accept, I'm not going to have a baby. Doesn't mean we've accepted and moved through the pain, but the reality of, I'm not going to birth a baby in this lifetime. Now there's a void. And the longer the void sits there, the easier it is to turn to escapism. of whatever, right? Or staying too busy, using drugs and alcohol, becoming too angry. We want to fill that emptiness with something. And because it's a second chakra, we want to fill it with something creative, whether that's gardening or tending to animals or writing a song or poetry or painting or anything we can do that helps us connect our second chakra to our heart, because it's a big heart loss. We feel it in the second and we feel it in the heart. So understanding where I feel it in my body, and now what can I give those parts of my body? That's an important piece. And as you move through it, like you said, there are days when you're going to feel okay. And then there are times when it hits you that, wow, this is the reality. As you continue to move through it, and as someone continues to move through it, as you bring in other ways to nurture, so that can be helping other women and men that realize they can't have children. When we start to give, Chiron is a wounded healer archetype. Chiron's a big part of a lot of people's stories. And that can be whether it's a divorce or a bad relationship or however we live our life cycle where we have a big loss. Now we have a wounded healer, and we can use that to help other people. And that does help fill the void because you're using that beautiful mother nurturing energy to help others. And it's, sometimes it's enough and sometimes it isn't. And you might go through life, anybody, and on the deathbed, they think, I didn't have children. However, if we fill our lives with other things that feel good and nurturing, it maybe won't feel like such a big loss because you've evolved beyond that piece. I'm such a believer in our soul contract. And if we don't have children or we lose a child that from foster care or whatever the loss is, what's the soul story in that? Why did that happen to me on a soul level? And that piece, like you were really serious about a guy that didn't want to have children. And that kept coming up, that theme. And why? Why is that? Why was that not part of my journey in this lifetime? And we want to go into that, hopefully, with an open-mindedness of, I wonder why that wasn't part of my journey. Is there something I'm supposed to do instead? Because that's freed up a whole lot of time.
And Meg, I'm curious for friends of friends who are going through this. Andrea gave a bunch of great examples of how we can be supportive. I'm curious if you have anything to add to that list.
Some people are so afraid to talk about it. My mom and dad lost their second child, carried it through, and then died right after birth. No one came to the funeral. No one reached out to them. And this was back in the 50s. And now people have gotten a little more emotionally intelligent, but still people aren't. There's many that are not. So they don't even know how. And when they're afraid of it, they sometimes do nothing. Or as you heard, God, you're still going through it. We get to ask for what we need. And that's sometimes really hard because it puts us in a vulnerable position. It was beautiful that you acknowledged that, Nicole. How did that help you as your friend? How did I help you and how did I not? So we get to ask, how can I support you through this? And if they don't have an answer, that's okay. Maybe they just don't have an answer. When someone's going through grief, sometimes they don't have an answer. And when they have an answer, they might come forward with it. But then you can suggest something small. Can I bring you a meal? Or can I bring you some flowers? But I would ask, is this something that will help you in your journey? It takes courage to ask someone that's grieving, what do you need from me? How can I support you? And it takes courage for that person that is grieving to call a friend and say, I really need you right now. Our society hasn't been set up that way, but we get to change that. That's our goal. Our job is to help bring more open support. So ask those questions, ask those hard questions in a loving, kind way, without an attachment to outcome. There are people that are wanting to give, but they take it personally when their giving isn't received. So if you're one of those people, anyone in this audience, try not to take that journey personally. Let the grieving person decide what's good for them.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. And I know that, Dre, you mentioned this earlier about you've never stayed in a relationship that didn't feel right, which I think is actually quite unique. I think a lot of people stay in relationships a lot longer than even if they recognize I'm guilty of that. Um, but I just want to point out that I think that extends beyond just relationships. If there's one thing that I really, really admire about you, is that you really know what you need, even if you don't know. There, you live your life, you go out in nature, you do all of these things that I think are you're a great model for anyone who's going through whatever. As your friend, I just want to reflect back to you how so much of your body's wisdom, your mind, your soul, everything, you make great choices for how to create the space you need. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think that you've done an incredible job of just being really highly emotionally intelligent. And whether you think you know what you need or not, I've just noticed you've taken steps to really nurture yourself, particularly going into nature, which I need to do more of myself. So you've been a great model to me as well.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I'll just say sometimes it's just, I heard this phrase once and it really stuck with me. It's just like heeding my own whispers.
Yes.
Sometimes, I'm listening and letting go of the shoulds or shouldn'ts, which is an ongoing process, especially around sense of duty. Oh, well, I should do this. If I'm a good friend, I will do this. And it's been a journey, but I feel like those moments grief has taught me a lot. And it's almost like an experience that is so overtaking, like a tidal wave, a tsunami that comes in, and it kind of barrels through some of the shoulds and the shouldn'ts because I just have to do what my body has the capacity to do today. And so I will give credit to, the journey of grief for helping me come into more contact with listening to those whispers that help me tune into what do I need right now.
Side note, I love that phrase, heeding the whispers and really tuning in to what you need. I say this in the conversation, but I was so happy that Andrea just knew when to say yes to invitations and when to say no. We have a particularly amazing friend group, and so no one took offense if she decided to opt out of a particular activity. She really took the space that she needed, and I love that. I hope everyone feels the freedom to do that. I hope everyone has communities that encourage individuals, regardless of what they're going through, to just take the time and the space. I remember when a bunch of my friends were getting married in our late 20s, early 30s. If somebody was going through a rough time, I remember people being like, yeah, but this is a happy occasion. They should be supporting you. Yes, of course. Yeah, in a perfect world, that would be the case. And you know what? Most people power through, and whatever they're going through, they'll show up. But I really am a big proponent in supporting friends to do whatever feels right for them, even if it feels disappointing. Like, oh, there's this big occasion, I want them here. What an expression of freedom to let go of the shoulds and shouldn'ts. I love everything that Dre just said here. She's such a great model for anyone who needs to heal on their terms, and I applaud that. And back to the conversation.
And if I can add to that, that's a beautiful learning. That's part of that Chiron, right? It was a wounding, and what can I bring forward from that wound? Because that does also start to fill the cup.
I just wanted to pick up on something that Meg had shared around the guilt and the shame that, women who are on this journey towards motherhood, and whether or not there's loss or it didn't happen for any number of different reasons, that is something that I'm still working with, especially the shame because of, and I think maybe it relates to a should of, which is antiquated, but this notion of women, our bodies are given this gift to create life. And for those of us that don't, in this very literal, primal way, that there's something missing, or we're not a full realized woman because of it, or and in my case, it's like, oh, I messed up, like looking back across the course of some of the things that I even shared about my own journey, maybe I should have done something different. And yeah, I just wanted to recognize that shame that does come from societal, I think, norms or assumptions and pressure is not helpful.
Mm.
So I think as we are moving forth, and Meg, you mentioned that, a lot of women are opting not to have children for whatever number of different reasons. It's just expanding the viewpoint of a woman's experience in her life and what gives meaning in that context.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And the journey that you are on, where you're going back through and saying, what did I do wrong? That's part of the process in any death. And that's a normal part of the process. And we can eat ourselves alive that way. And then to recognize, maybe this is how it was supposed to play out. I don't know.
It's the great mystery, right?
It's a great mystery.
Meg, an activity that you have suggested for me, which I have yet to do, but I think about it often, is writing letters to myself, especially during my pregnancy. Andrea had a front row seat, as did you, of a lot of the anxiety that I had. I'm wondering if that same exercise applies here, and if you have other similar recommendations, whether they're like journal prompts or something for somebody who is maybe not as far along as Andrea is in her process, or perhaps even beyond that. If you have any recommendations on steps to take to move through this grieving process into acceptance.
Yeah, and writing is a beautiful tool. And why? Because our mind moves at the speed of light. Our body is denser. So when we write, it helps us slow down enough to become much more concise and step into reality. Writing can get us out of the illusion and into reality. And so asking some of those questions, why did I want to have children? What was that about? What's underneath that? And there are layers. And then as you write that sentence down, why did I want to have children? What's underneath that? Read that. Well, what's underneath that? So you go through a process of the steps. And sometimes it gets all the way down to, because I want something to love, or because I don't want to be alone. Whatever that is, it's going to be different for all people or similar. But to go there, because then you get to the core. Now how can I use this energy? And it's a much easier way to forgive self. And also, yes, letters to self. I'm such a believer in, we are pretty hard on ourselves, humans. So when you're writing letters to self, do it from a loving space. Do it from a nurturing space. Try not to do it from a shame and condescending place. And if that comes, that's okay, because that's part of the journey. Then I encourage you to write something that is healthy, the opposite, nurturing. So for every statement that comes off unkind to self, fill it with something that is kind to self. And those are pieces that helps. And like I said earlier, there's a void. There's a physical void, but there's also an emotional and a soul void. And what do I want to fill that with? So paying that attention to that and writing that down, brainstorming ideas. What can I fill that with? Our body always tells the truth, never lies. The mind does. The mind is the tricky one. But we put our hand on our lower belly and we work from there. That gets us grounded, but it also keeps us in the truth. And that's where our body always wants to talk. We just got to slow down and listen.
Slow down and listen. It's a lot harder than that sounds, for sure.
Sure is. Because our mind moves at the speed of light.
And also, I always say that my favorite defense mechanism is doing, and like, okay, I'm just going to keep busy and I'm not going to feel this. And I've gotten better about that, but that has been a lifelong process.
Yeah. And to that point, I'll just add, sometimes I look back on the fact that I went through this experience through COVID, when
Yeah.
we were still, people were testing before they would get together. And in a certain way, I realized it was a blessing because it limited me in the number of ways that I could distract by doing, or, just, yeah. So journaling was hugely resourceful and helpful to my journey for that very reason that you mentioned, Meg. I mean, I think when you're in such an acute space of grief, you're just flooded with so many emotions. It's hard to discern, like, what am I feeling right now, and how do I start to unpack it, this, however it's manifesting. And writing for me, and I write with pen and paper, it really, it it calibrates the pace at which I can pull out of me my truth. And it was so helpful to even understanding what was what I was feeling, why. And I think the questions you offered, Meg, are spot on in terms of why was motherhood so important to me, and how can I channel the maternal instincts and energy that I have to give? How do I channel that and express that now versus assuming that it's gone? What do I do with this? And it really was, I would say, probably the most helpful bridge to getting to know what was happening for me and finding the bridge towards the opportunities that present from the fact that, okay, the outcome was that I am not a mother. What do I want to do with the space, time, and energy that this gives me to create meaning? Because meaning for me was really, I was void of it in the time, and I kept asking, like, what's the point? It was a question that would just haunted me. What's the point now? And I am still working towards my purpose, heeding the whispers, but I have leaned into and embraced the opportunities in the space that the outcome has given me, and in thinking intentionally on how I want to use it.
And I would love to add on to that. You brought up such a good point. Now I'm not a mother. There's a mother archetype. And there are people that have children that don't carry the mother archetype. They're not nurturing. And there are people like you that have that mothering, nurturing,
Yes.
and you don't have children. And then, of course, there are some nurturing that do. So there's a huge gray. And even though you don't have biological children, you still have this incredible mothering energy. And you get to decide where you're going to put it, because our world sure needs it.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of places that you can put that beautiful mothering energy, you and any other people that are listening.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Because even as mothers, my kids are out of the house now. They don't always want, even in teens, they don't want my mothering. So I got to find places, right? We all get to. It's a journey as a mother, or with children, or a mother without children.
And I'll pipe in here that I'm sort of throwing together an impromptu blessing celebration, what some might see as a baptism for Dylan while my parents are in town. And I spoke to the person who's going to be conducting this. It's not going to be traditional at all. But he asked me, he's like, do you have godparents or something, the equivalent of it? And something that I've been just holding within me, not really talking about, is that I was like, if I ever do something like a baptism like this, I have such a list of people who I see as people I want to guide Dylan through life. And each one has their own contribution, like unique contribution, which I think Dylan will benefit from. And so this conversation happened yesterday, but I invited Andrea to be one of them. And I and one of the things that I said to her is, just thank you for being such an obvious choice. Just thank you for being an obvious choice. When you think about how difficult life can be, what an incredible, fortunate thing that you have people in your life who are obvious choices to guide your little one through life. And I think that's one role, Dre, that you have for sure, that you can pour some of that mothering energy into, because watching you with Dylan it puts my heart and mind at ease. I can do other things, like as a sole parent, you're doing everything. And so the times that you come over and you play with her, it's just like, to know on such a deep level that your child's in good hands. I can't think of anything more helpful and loving. And yeah, so I just wanted to add that.
Well, thank you. And truly it is a gift and an honor to be invited to assume that role in Dylan's life. And I feel this way with all my friends with kids. It's such a beautiful opportunity, especially my friends that are so proactive about wanting me to get time with their children. And I really just think about the idea of community and the definition of family and the intersection with community and what family is above and beyond just a traditional family structure. So I'm honored to be a part of yours.
And that's what this whole podcast is about, is that family is what you define. And actually, Meg was instrumental in helping me see that, where it's just like redefining family. I'm redefining family by bringing my child into the world and being both parents to her, but also expanding her world by having other loving parental figures in her life. So you're obviously a huge one. Meg, did you have any final thoughts that you wanted to add? And then Dre, I'll follow up with you as well.
This has been a beautiful conversation, first of all. So I'm very honored to be a part of it. And that concept of motherhood, just remind yourselves, remember, if I can't be, for whatever reason, a biological mother, what can I do? And maybe I can be an auntie, or maybe I can be a pseudo grandma. There's so many ways. And when we give that a chance, you actually might find that that's fulfilling enough. We don't know. But just to allow the openness and try some new things.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I would just add to that, just all the ways to be a mother, like you say, in this world, Meg. And one of the ways that have presented to me is, we're in this phase of life where many of us have aging parents and they're going to have needs, and not having become a mother with my own child, when my mom passed, I had to assume the primary caregiver role for my dad and to kind of get things into a place. And I was so grateful that I had the space to be able to do that. And that I realized that role of showing up for my dad from the perspective of taking care of his needs, like that was a channel for me to express my mothering energy, my maternal instinct, which was beautiful. And I'm grateful that I could.
And as a witness to that whole process, I cannot express how much, Andrea, you pulled. I think I used the word infrastructure yesterday, like the infrastructure that you built to make the best possible care for your dad, especially amidst, grieving your mom. There's just so much. I just hats off to you. you did have the space and energy barely. I mean, there was so much going on, but I'm just saying, like, to be able to pour your mothering into that, the mothering energy to that was very apparent.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Nicole. So just to highlight that sometimes it's in these, obvious ways, is I love my role as an auntie, and sometimes not the most obvious ways that present themselves in our lives. So.
And Dre, do you have any thoughts or wisdom, any message to somebody who is on their own journey, regardless of where they are in the path? Any words of wisdom you'd like to share?
To think of one thing to leave is just really to listen to yourself, heed those whispers. If you are a woman who, is in your mid 30s, late 30s, and you want to be a mother, pursue it in whatever way resonates for you. And know, because a big part for me, and sometimes I was scared to pursue it to the degree that I did, because I was scared of the disappointment of trying very intentionally and not having it happen. Know that you will get through it, and it will be hard. And there are so many ways to resource oneself and resources out there to support you, and they will show up. I give gratitude every day that job came into my life, because it allowed me to pursue it to the degree that I can move on with my life and know that I tried. In hindsight, I'm glad that I pushed forth with taking very tangible action steps to try and become a mother. I sort of look at it as the Hail Mary. And while the grief that came with an outcome of not having worked was absolutely challenging to move through, I did it, and it made me more resilient, and it's helped shape who I am today. And I can move forward with the gratitude that I was able to try. And that was one thing that really prompted me in that moment of, go or no go. I don't want to regret not having tried. If I'm not to become a mother in this life, at least I tried, versus I kind of let the cards fall where they may. And sometimes that happens, but at least I wanted to have a sense of having done all that was within my control.
Beautiful. Well, big hugs to you, Dre. You are so inspirational, and I just so thank you for having this conversation. A few months ago, I had brought this up, and I said, I know this is a really sensitive topic. I just, if you ever felt moved to have that conversation, I said, it will probably be the most powerful and resonant episode that I would have, because I do think that there are so many women, and I'm sure there's men as well, who really want to be a father, and perhaps that dream doesn't come to fruition. I hear it more often with women. It's not something often expressed. Going back to the shame and guilt that we've been talking about, it's almost like, well, that it didn't happen for me. Nobody, I'm just going to deal with this in private. And I just think too many women are going through this, and probably feeling alone in it. And so I just appreciate everything that you gave this conversation. Meg, you too. Oh my gosh, you've been so helpful to me over the years in just making sense of what's happening. And really, everybody's on their own path. There's so much navigation to happen in a lifetime. And I thank you both for having such an incredible conversation. So raw and real and beautiful at the same time.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It's important. It's an important piece.
And I'll also just add, Meg, you were hugely helpful to me in many of the journeys that I've described in this episode. So thank you. And I'm so glad that you were here today. And Nicole, thank you for giving platform for this conversation, because it can feel like such an isolating, uncommon experience. And I hope that women can hear this and not feel alone in their journey.
Me too. Thank you. I also want to just mention to our audience that this conversation I'm having with two incredible coaches. I'm going to put in on the website, their websites, but also just wanting to mention that if anybody needs help moving through change or wants some intuitive guidance, Meg and Dre are amazing and highly recommend reaching out to them if that's something that you feel you could benefit from.
Also, if you're part of a unique family and you want to have a conversation with me, please reach out. Doingthisdifferently.com. Happy to chat with you. I think it's really important, as I've had these conversations with all these different families, normalizing what makes your family unique is really helpful. It also helps children learn about inclusion and opens their minds as well as their parents, and gives everybody a shared language and understanding of what it means to be a unique family. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.